Vertex color can be a very useful way to establish color information in your diffuse map. Depending on your polypainting skills, it could even serve as your primary means for texturing. But for how I usually work, I tend to keep the vertex color map pretty simple and more of a guide for texturing in Photoshop and Body Paint, which I'll go over in the next volume. I discussed polypaint in greater detail in volume 2 of this series, but the basic idea for me is to lay down some paint on the model before baking to get a good feel for how everything is coming together. And you can see it's not super precise painting. I mean, I actually started poly painting when the model was at a much lower subdivision level. So you can see it's kind of pixelated here, even though the model is actually fairly high res. But that's fine. So in the process of doing all this, I will have created a map that I can at least use as a starting point for my texture. And this is what I'll be exporting here. I'm just going to export this one subtool, this head, which is really just this. And I do this a lot for these pieces. I'll kind of bake things in isolation. So I'll select it, and if I need to, I'll decimate it or whatever. But be careful with decimation, because you could lose your poly paint if you don't have like UVs or you don't go through the effort of reprojecting after decimation. You may lose your poly paint. But in this case, this is fine. I'll export it using the export here in the tool menu. But I've already done that, and this is my low polygon model here. And you can see that it's actually got more to it than just the head. And this is because for the purposes of baking the normal map, I knew that all of these pieces were going to be contiguous, so I wanted the normals to be correct in those areas, which is why on the low poly I have these extra meshes here. So that's the high poly and the low poly model. If I go to X normal here, you can see I have the high poly head loaded here and the low poly head here. And the one thing you want to make sure you change is under high definition meshes. If you go to the right here, you want to make sure that ignore per vertex color is off. By default, that this is on, and that's what you want. You want it to ignore the vertex color when baking the other maps, but because we are baking the vertex colors here, you don't want it to ignore it. And that's what polypaint basically is. It's just vertex color. So, and when you export your model from ZBrush, in OBJ format, it will come with the vertex colors in the model automatically. So after that, just go to baking options, scroll down, and you'll see bake high poly's vertex colors here. Just check that, and there aren't really any options worth changing here. That's fine. Background color white, that's fine. And just generate the map. And luckily this map is pretty easy to render, and it's pretty quick. So if I go to Photoshop now, this is the result. Now you can see again when I zoom in that this is pretty crude. Again, I poly painted it at a low subdivision, so it's pretty messy here. But this is perfectly fine for my purposes. I don't need a perfect vertex color map. What I'll be using this for is just a base, and I'll be painting over this quite a bit anyway. But you can see that I don't have any really extreme shadows going on. I mean, there's darkness behind the eyes, but a lot of the shading here is pretty subtle, and that's just because I just painted what looked good in ZBrush, in that ZBrush view, and whatever I do there, I feel like that's enough shading. I don't need to, and in fact you shouldn't do shade it really heavily. But anyway, so this is the map that you would come up with, and I will go into more detail about how I use this map for texturing in the next volume.